The first thing you need to know is this: the window does not face the world. It faces you, always. Whether you stand before it or not, it carries the weight of an unseen gaze, a silent watcher embedded in the brick of a town that should have never existed. And if you found yourself here, listening to my words, it means you have already stepped past the threshold. You are inside the frame now, and what waits within will not let you go unchanged. October 1896. A year after the vanishing of Elias Finch, another name crept quietly into the records of Kentucky's forgotten borderlands: Elijah Barrett. Like Finch before him, Barrett was a man obsessed with ghosts that left no bodies, towns that erased themselves, and faiths that refused the sun. His journey brought him to the ruins of Willow Forge, though locals spat when they heard the name. They called it cursed ground, soil that swallowed its dead without proof, a place where no sound dared linger. But Barrett had something Finch never carried, an arrogance sharpened by ambition. He was determined to photograph what Finch had failed to capture, and it was this hunger, this refusal to leave the silence intact, that sealed his fate. You must understand, Willow Forge was not simply abandoned, it was erased. Farmers who ploughed its bordering hills swore the trees leaned unnaturally inward, closing like cathedral arches around a space that rejected light. Hunters claimed their dogs would not cross the ridge, whining as if struck, eyes wide as if sensing something unnameable. Maps, once inked with the township's name, bled white when copied. County surveyors reported entire plots reappearing blank the morning after they'd charted them. And yet, for all its refusal to exist, one structure remained persistent in memory, an orphanage whose windows looked inward rather than outward, and one particular window that should not have been there at all. The lightless window. That is what archivists, whispering late at night in Cincinnati, came to call it. A pane of glass framed not in wood or stone, but in absence, a geometry that broke itself to be whole. Those who looked too long swore they saw lips moving, a sermon mouthed in silence. The problem was not what the figure said, it was that the words arrived in your own mind before you heard them, like a memory seeded, not spoken, and once planted, it grew. Barrett's journal, though mostly ruined by river water when it was recovered, survives in fragments. And fragments are all the truth ever leaves us. In one entry, dated September 30th, 1896, he writes, "The forge is still, no bird, no cricket, no leaf stirs. My shadow does not answer me here. I set the tripod at dusk. The glass will hold the truth even if my eyes cannot. I feel watched, not from above but from behind my ribs. A second window waits for me, I must not turn." That line, "a second window waits for me," has echoed across generations of scholars and theologians who cannot agree on what it means. Some argue he described an architectural illusion. Others believe he referred to an inner vision, a psychological mirror turned against him. But in the doctrine of Willow Forge, preserved only in scattered sermon fragments, there is one passage that clarifies more than it obscures. The unseen is not elsewhere. It is the opening within the opening, the mouth inside the wall. Blessed is the frame that sees what eyes cannot. Do you understand the weight of those words? This was not a faith that sought salvation through revelation. This was a cult of subtraction. They believed that sight itself was a curse, that to be named, to be reflected, to be witnessed, was to be diminished. To them, windows were not made for light. They were made for concealment. The second window was not to look through, it was to low, okay into you. When Barrett developed his final plate, the negative revealed what his eyes had not. He had positioned his camera before the orphanage's eastern wall, cracked and devoured by ivy. In the emulsion, however, the wall was whole, immaculate, no ruin, no weathering, just smooth brick. And in its corner, impossibly precise, was the lightless window. Behind it stood a woman. Tall, robed, faceless, her hand pressed to the glass as if sealing herself in or reaching outward to touch whoever dared look back. Witnesses say the hand appeared not like flesh, but like ash suspended mid-motion, and behind her open palm, the faint shape of children, dozens of them standing in silence, each with lips sewn shut not by thread, but by absence itself. Barrett's log ends abruptly after this plate. His camera was later found dismantled in a boarding house in Portsmouth, lens shattered, bellows slit. He had destroyed every negative but one, and like Finch before him, mailed it to the museum with no explanation, only a slip of paper that read, "The window does not close." Days later, Barrett was gone. Some say he drowned in the Ohio. Others whisper he did not leave the forge at all, that he became part of the wall, part of the frame, absorbed by the doctrine that had devoured those before him. What unsettles me most is not the photograph itself, but what has happened to it since. Every reproduction of Barrett's plate grows darker at the edges, as if shadow thickens with time. But the lightless window, it grows clearer, sharper, almost eager to be seen, as though the more you look, the more it learns to look back. And here is the secret no archivist dares admit. Men who spend too long with that image begin to dream of it. They wake to find themselves staring at their own windows in the night, convinced that something on the other side is mouthing their name. Some burn the curtains, some board the glass, a few go further, removing every mirror, every reflection, every possibility of being seen. It always ends the same. The window finds them anyway. It does not need wood or glass. It needs only awareness. The moment you know of it, you have already opened it. And now you know. The lightless window is not a story about a ghost. It is a story about erasure, about the way truth folds in on itself until what was hidden becomes the only thing that survives. This is why I speak to you not as a storyteller, but as a warning. The frame is already open. And once we continue deeper, there will be no turning back. You think it was only about a photograph, that the horror began with Barrett's glass plate or Finch's cracked lens, but the lightless window is older than any camera. It was carved into belief before it was ever burned into emulsion. To understand why Willow Forge birthed something so impossible, you must understand the doctrine that shaped it, the strange theology of subtraction, of namelessness, of children unmade before they were grown. Most religions offer light as salvation. Here, light was considered the wound. Reverend Thaddeus Bell, the shadowy figure who led the Forge in the 1840s, wrote sermons that scholars later described as anti-creationist. Where others believed God spoke the world into being, Bell taught that speech fractured the eternal, that naming carved the soul into pieces. His followers were not seeking heaven. They were trying to retreat back into the unformed, to vanish into the unseen. In their creed, the visible was a trap, a cage of longing. To be seen was to be condemned. And so they built their homes with shutters layered in ash. They blackened every pane of glass. They taught their children not to look upon their own reflections until they were old enough to forget themselves. And at the heart of this doctrine stood one symbol, the window that opened inward, never outward. The lightless window. To them, it was not a flaw in architecture. It was an opening to what they called the mercy hidden, a mercy that did not shine. It devoured. The sermons that survive are fragments, scrawled on newsprint, hidden in the spines of Bibles, etched on walls, later torn down. But certain phrases repeat with disturbing clarity. Let no child see its face before 7. The visible is Cain's error. Blessed is the house without light. And most chilling, the second window waits for all. Understand what this means. The Forge was not merely afraid of the world. They believed the world itself was a deception, that behind every wall, behind every reflection, another mouth opened. They feared it. They worshipped it. They gave their children to it. By 1842, outsiders already whispered of strange rituals within the orphanage. It was said that infants were not named at birth. Instead, jars of soot were kept by the hearth, each jar holding what the elders called the first name. When a child reached the age of 7, that jar was broken, the name breathed out, then erased from memory. The child would be renamed by silence, raised not as an individual but as a vessel of the unseen. To them, the self was not a gift. It was a sickness to be burned away. This is why neighboring farmers refused to trade with them. They said the people of Willow Forge did not speak their names. When you asked them who they were, they hummed instead of answering, like a funeral hymn with no words. Travelers reported children with veils tied over their faces, women turning their backs before speaking, and men staring not at your eyes but past them, as though you were only a shadow of something they were truly addressing. And yet, for all its strangeness, the forge grew. By 1845, 17 millies were counted in tax records, though none left signatures, only initials scrawled in charcoal. By 1847, a burial ground called Still Acre appeared on county plats, though no birth records exist for the children buried there. And in 1851, everything vanished. Land reverted to the state, the church collapsed, the records ended, but the doctrine did not die. It lingered. It whispered itself forward. When Finch arrived in 1895 and Barrett in 1896, they were not photographing ruins. They were photographing the residue of belief, the scar tissue of a faith that had consumed itself. The lightless window was not just an architectural anomaly, it was the last opening of a doctrine that refused to be seen, a survival of something meant to be erased. Archivists studying Barrett's plate noted something unnerving. The longer they stared at the image, the clearer the window became, not just clearer but sharper, as if the negative was still developing itself decades after exposure. In the margins of one archivist's notes from 1923 is a single sentence: "The glass grows teeth." He never explained, he never published again. He vanished 6 months later. Do you see the pattern now? Men drawn to the image, men consumed. Finch, Barrett, archivists, historians. The window opens not once, but again and again, each time someone learns of it, each time someone stares long enough to see more than stone. It does not need a town, it does not need a church, it does not even need Willow Forge. It survives in knowledge, and you are hearing it now. But here is where the danger sharpens. In the fragments of Reverend Bell's doctrine, there is a prophecy, though he would never have called it that. He wrote of the hour of forgetting, a moment when the unseen would not wait behind the wall but step through. His words: "When the second window is seen by those not of us, it will not return to see. Ilence, it will not close, and the faces that once were nameless will be named again in mouths not their own." If that is true, then Finch's photograph was not an accident. It was an invitation. Barrett's reproduction was not a discovery, it was a continuation, and every scholar, every archivist, every listener who learns of it becomes another frame, another opening. I warned you at the beginning. To know of the lightless window is to open it. To hear its history is to stand before it. The forge is gone, but the doctrine remains. And once the unseen has been named in your ears, it waits. Not in ruins, not in photographs, but in your own reflection. So ask yourself, when you stare into the glass tonight, will you see yourself? Or will you see something mouthing words you cannot hear? Will you see the second window waiting? And if you do, will you have the strength to look away? You've felt it already, haven't you? That uneasy pressure in the chest, as if someone unseen leans just behind your shoulder. That is how the forge worked. Not with spectacle, not with fire and brimstone, but with silence that pressed itself into the bone until even breathing felt intrusive. And at the center of that silence was the place they called the orphan hearth. Forget the lies told in official records, forget the word orphanage that archivists stamped on Barrett's photograph. The forge never raised children the way you imagine. They unmade them. They called it mercy. They believed every child entered the world carrying a burden too dangerous, a name, a shadow of self, a flicker of individuality. To them, that was corruption. To them, to allow a child to know its own reflection was to sentence it to fracture, to exile from the unseen. So they gathered the children in a place with no windows, no mirrors, no books, only a great iron stove and a circle of 12 chairs. This was the orphan hearth, and in its silence children were stripped of identity. Travelers spoke of it, though few admitted it directly. A circuit teacher named Amos Teller wrote in his journal of entering a structure with no door, only an opening that appeared when you stood at the right angle. He said the air inside tasted of soot. He saw children standing back to back, eyes lowered, their lips moving in silence. When he asked the elder what they were doing, the answer chilled him. They are remembering their first names so they may forget them. Teller never returned. His journal was found decades later, hidden in the spine of a dismantled courthouse ledger, like someone wanted his words discovered only by accident. And there was another account, far more disturbing. In 1883, a retired mill worker named Simon Yelverton gave an interview about his childhood. He said his father once delivered goods to Willow Forge. As a boy, he peeked through a crack in one of the blackened shutters. Inside, he saw children circling an iron stove, humming in thirds, voices out of tune like a broken clock. He swore that one girl carried a jar in her hands, blackened and sealed. When he asked what it was, an elder told him, "It holds the name she had before." Think of that, a jar that holds your name, a ritual that removes the sound of who you are from your very breath. Imagine being 7 years old and told to hand over your own reflection, to bury your own voice. That is what the Forge called mercy. That is what the doctrine demanded. But the darkest evidence of the orphan hearth came not from witnesses, but from the earth itself. In 1958, when researchers pried loose stones from the ruins of a cottage east of the Forge, they discovered a page hidden behind the hearthstone. It was a child's writing exercise, no ink, only impressions pressed into the paper, as if the child had been ordered to write without leaving mark. Under low forensic light, the words surfaced. "We say the names to the jar, then we burn the jar with no fire. Then we are not them. The window will not open, unless we forget." Do you see it now? They were not teaching children to read. They were teaching them to erase, to write without ink, to speak without sound, to remember only so they could forget. It was pedagogy as annihilation, education not to build the self, but to subtract it until only silence remained. And in that silence, the second window was said to open. Every doctrine hides its secret in ritual, and for Willow Forge, that ritual was erasure. Scholars now call it the pedagogy of erasure, but the name is too clean, too academic. In truth, it was psychological dismemberment disguised as faith. The Forge believed that by stripping away reflection, identity, even memory, the children could become vessels for something larger, something that crested behind the tree line, something they dared not name. They called it the mother's shape, and it is here the horror deepens. Because the figure Barrett captured in his plate, the faceless woman, hand pressed to the glass, matches perfectly the oral histories of the mother's shape. She was described as tall, unsmiling, robed in flax, carrying a jar of soot. Not a mother of flesh, but of silence. A presence that stood at the edge of every child's forgetting. In sermon fragments she appears again and again. The unseen listens with a mother's shape. She holds the name until it burns. Do you understand the implications? The Forge did not invent her. They remembered her. They believed she was the unseen itself, the one who waited behind the second window, and through the children's erasure they invited her closer. Now, ask yourself, why did Barrett's photograph decades later show her behind the lightless window? Because she was still there, because she never left, because every name erased, every reflection denied, gave her more ground to stand upon. And when Barrett opened his shutter when light struck the plate, it didn't just capture the ruin of a wall, it captured the persistence of a ritual. It captured what the Forge had fed into silence for decades. This is why archivists whisper of dreams, why men wake to see their windows staring back at them. Once you know her, once you understand what the Forge gave her, she lingers. She waits in glass, in mirrors, in the corner of your vision. You will not hear her speak. You will hear yourself speak words you did not choose. You will find phrases rising to your tongue that do not belong to you. And when you stand before your window tonight, with the darkness pressing close, you will wonder, did you choose to look, or were you called to? Did you open the frame, or was it always open, waiting for you to remember what others tried so hard to forget? The orphan hearth may be dust now, its stones scattered, its children long gone, but the ritual of erasure does not end with their bones. It ends with you when you look too long into the window that does not close. You might think Willow Forge died when its roofs caved in and its fields grew wild, But beliefs don't stay buried just because a town does. They travel, they seep into new soil, infecting those who listen. The forge may have burned its names, but the doctrine of the unseen, its whispers, its sermons, its rituals of erasure, spilled beyond its hollow. And once it crossed the river valleys of Kentucky, it became harder to distinguish where the forge ended and where its shadow began. The first signs appeared not in churches, but in dreams. During the revival waves of the 1850s, circuit preachers recorded something peculiar. Entire congregations reported the same visions after night sermons, voices speaking backwards, words unspoken yet already remembered, hymns that ended with silence pressing heavier than sound. One preacher from Portsmouth confessed that in his dreams he stood before a window that opened into darkness, and behind it a faceless woman mouthed the final verse of his sermon before he ever preached it. He did not tell his congregation, he burned his notes. But the dream returned every time he tried to preach on light, salvation, or the resurrection. He began to speak only of subtraction, only of absence. His church emptied. He died raving, refusing to allow mirrors near his coffin. Do you see? The doctrine infected not just the land, but the mind. Even those who mocked Willow Forge found themselves reciting its phrases in sleep. There is evidence buried in government archives, fragments historians were never meant to read. In 1937, researcher Grace Hallowell uncovered a folder in the archives of the National Society of Friends. It was labeled Willow Doctrine. 7 sermons handwritten in the 1830s, all attributed to a minister named Edom Lee, but no Quaker records list that name. He never existed, at least not officially. And one of those sermons carried the most disturbing line yet preserved. Blessed be the house without light, for it reveals what mercy has hidden. Let no child see their reflection before age 7, for the self is not given but assigned. Stop here and think. That is not Christianity. That is not even mysticism. That is psychological control dressed as faith. To forbid a child their own reflection is to sever them from themselves. To tell them their self is assigned is to erase their freedom before they ever learn its shape. This was not worship. This was a system designed to strip a community of individuality, to bind every soul to an unseen mouth behind a wall no one else could see. And yet the fragments did not stop at religious circles. By the late 19th century, documents appear in state files with odd markings, a watermark of a closed eye encircled by roots, margins filled with instructions like, "Do not send men with torches, they will not return." Officials labeled these papers irrelevant, filed them as curiosities, anomalies of misfiled clerks. But men who touched those files began to leave strange notes of their own. One inspector in 1891 scribbled into the margin of a tax document, "The window waits. I saw my hand press against glass, though I never moved." His handwriting was calm, deliberate. Weeks later he resigned without explanation and disappeared from census records. The spread of the doctrine was not accidental, it was systemic. Every society that wishes to control must first erase. Willow Forge had perfected a technology of forgetting. It used soot instead of ink, silence instead of scripture, jars instead of baptismal fonts. The state uses other tools, census omissions, missing records, archives redacted in black. But the mechanism is the same, the erasure of the self until only obedience remains. You must see the parallel. The Forge was not an isolated cult, it was a prototype, a laboratory of silence. And what about the lightless window itself? Witnesses in towns far from the Forge began to speak of it. In 1868, a widow in Gallipolis, Ohio, reported seeing a square of perfect darkness appear on her bedroom wall each night at 3. Behind it, a pale hand hovered, palm outward, fingers bent as though in the act of warning. She moved homes twice. The window followed her. In 1872, a group of miners in Breathitt County described a similar phenomenon. A pane of blackness framed in air appearing in the shaft wall where no wood or stone stood. They said it whispered without sound, a vibration in the chest. 2 miners refused to return to work. One hanged himself before sunrise. The report was quietly sealed by the mining company, but the notes survive in a private collection passed down by a foreman's grandson. By the 1890s, when Finch and Barrett raised their cameras, the doctrine had already metastasized into folklore. Farmers warned children not to pull point their shadows west, lest they forget to follow. Women whispered not to stay between two windows after dusk. Men muttered that if you saw a window where there should be none, you must look away at once, or risk being named by something that never bore a name of its own. But here is the secret no one wants to admit. The lightless window is not merely folklore. It is infrastructure. It spreads like a system because it is one. Each time it is seen, it builds itself again. Each time it is remembered, it gains new walls, new mouths, new shadows to press against. Finch thought he was capturing history. Barrett thought he was recording ruin. In truth, they were opening the doctrine again, giving it body, image, permanence. And every scholar, every archivist, every viewer since has given it more, including you. Think carefully now. You are not just hearing a story, you are participating in its spread. The forge burned its names so the window could be remembered instead, and you remember it now. The moment the words formed in your ears, you built another wall for it to stand against, another opening to press its hand, another face to mouth its sermon through. So I will ask you, if the doctrine of the unseen was designed to erase, what does that mean for you, hearing it now? Are you erasing yourself, or is something else erasing you, using your memory as its ash, your attention as its jar? Power does not fear ghosts. Power fears what ghosts teach it. The lightless window ceased being only a local heresy the moment bureaucrats learned how useful forgetting could be. Institutions, municipal offices, state archives, even military men with private ledgers are always looking for ways to turn mystery into mechanism. Willow Forge's doctrine was crude, corrosive, and ruthless. That made it valuable to those who needed citizens without names, records without faces, people who could be counted as numbers and not selves. By the late 19th century, the machinery of record-keeping in the United States had matured. Census rolls, land deeds, tax assessments, these are the scaffolding of identity. Who you are is what the ledger says. The forge attacked identity at its root. It erased names, hid births, and created a culture where the self could be rewritten by ritual. That technique was a map for officials who wanted the same erasure with gloves on. Administrative forgetting rather than ritual jars. Consider the plate. WF1T95P1, Barrett's last negative. It arrived at the museum wrapped in cloth. No note, just initials. The paper trail should have ended there, sealed under glass. But it did not. Men with keys to vaults and the authority to classify documents opened the package and did what institutions always do when confronted with the inexplicable. They catalogued, indexed, and hid. They turned the window into an accession number and buried its edges under bureaucracy. In doing so, they made it portable. A thing that exists on paper can be moved, copied, and repurposed. The doctrine of the unseen became archival property, and once the state understands the mechanics of forgetting, it begins to experiment. There are files, redacted now, yellowed then, that hint at more than folklore. A ledger in a county office marked miscellaneous contains a line in a clerk's hand. Requests for exemption filed under religious objection, 17 plots, not processed. Another note reads, orphans are counted as communal stock. Listen to the language, exemption, communal stock. The forge's children, unnamed and unregistered, become a model for administrative categories designed to strip legal personhood. You could call it efficiency, you could call it policy, but beneath the euphemisms live the same mechanisms of erasure. Do not imagine malevolent men in cloaks. This was often clerks and clerics who believed they were doing the right thing, practical men who prefer tidy ledgers to messy humanity. A tax assessor handed a dozen unsigned claims in 1839 might quietly file them under forfeit and move on. A state registrar, instructed to accept religious objections, files exemption and avoids inspection. Over time, patterns emerge. People whose names vanish from the files cannot vote, cannot own property, cannot be called to jury duty. They become invisible to legal recourse. The lightless window, once an inward-facing pane, now has an outward-facing cousin, the bureaucracy that refuses to see. And then there were the men who thought they could weaponize forgetting. In the 1890s, as social scientists and eugenic theorists built catalogues of human difference, some bureaucrats became curious about what happens when identity is erased on purpose. The military, always hungry for methods to break and remold men, took an interest in social experiments that produced obedient, nameless labor. Reports surfaced, buried under stamps and coded headings, discussing the benefits of collective identity removal in prisons and reformatories. Language changed, naming as liability, renaming as control. It's not a stretch to imagine a doctrine of erasure translated from ritual to policy. Remove the self, and the state expands its claim. This is why Barrett's plate matters beyond its ghostly woman. It became evidence that such erasure was possible, that a community could render itself legible only to those who chose to look. Each time officials copied that plate into dossiers, passed it between hands, or tucked it into classified boxes, they were not merely preserving curiosity. They were studying a technique. They were learning how to make citizens disappear without a trail. The lightless window moved from being a local horror to a prototype for modern forgetting, and the exchange was reciprocal. The doctrine of the unseen fed institutions the language of concealment. Institute ions fed the doctrine tools, redaction, classification, statistical omission, each reinforced the other. Farmers who once refused to say the town's name found their deeds mysteriously voided. Children once unnamed in the forge's ledger became in later years subjects of state care whose identities were managed and reassigned. You might call this progress. I call it the same work of erasure dressed in newer coats. Now, let me be frank with you. This is not merely historical abstraction. The mechanism exists in every bureaucratic system that prizes order over human names. It's in the way records can be lost, in how an entire community can be misfiled out of existence, in how certain faces disappear from archives when they become inconvenient to the state's narrative. The lightless window teaches a lesson institutions are happy to learn. Control the frame, and you control the people seen within it. And for you, sitting here, listening, reading, this is the dangerous pivot. Knowledge of erasure is not neutral. Once you know how a system hides its omissions, you are complicit in its revival when it suits those who would use it. Information makes the construct portable, like a virus carried in a ledger. The very act of transferring Barrett's image from shelf to shelf, database to database, spread the doctrine's architecture further than ritual ever could. This is about more than museums and clerks. It is about the nature of being legible in a world run by records. The lightless window shows us that absence can be engineered, that people can be made to vanish without a single dramatic arrest, and that when systems learn how to erase, they will. Now, halfway through this descent, I want you to do something that will matter more than you realize. Type the phrase, "I am unframed," into the comment box, not once but twice. Type it exactly in capital letters back to back. Do it to lock it into this moment. Do it because ritual works in tongues both ancient and modern. Why this phrase? Because you must choose whether you are the kind of man who lets systems name him or the kind of man who refuses to be catalogued. To write it twice is to make a small, defiant act of naming your refusal. And yes, it also binds you to this story in a way that cannot be easily undone. That is the cost of knowledge. Do it now. Type, "I am unframed." I am unframed. Seal the moment. Archives are not neutral. They are cathedrals of silence built to hold memory in chains. And when Barrett's plate was slid into its drawer in the Cincinnati Museum, sealed under accession number WF11895P1, the lightless window did not die. It grew teeth. It waited for men in gloves to open the drawer, to lean close, to let their eyes linger too long. That is where the doctrine spread next, not through sermons, not through families, but through archivists, through the men who thought they were preserving history, when in fact history was preserving them. You see, archivists are not unlike the forge. They worship the unseen. They live in temperature-controlled vaults, whispering to pages no one else will ever read. Their work is the management of ghosts. And Barrett's plate was no ordinary ghost. It was a parasite. From the first moment a curator lifted the glass negative against the light, the window stared back. The report says nothing unusual. The man wrote only, "Pane intact, emulsion consistent," but in the margin he added one odd line, "Hand pressed to glass, left palm, fingers bent." There was no hand on the plate then, none that others could see. Yet within 3 months, colleagues began to notice something faint in the image, like a smudge that deepened each time it was inspected. By 1901, the hand was visible in copies. By 1909, it had become the defining feature of the plate. How does a negative develop after exposure? It should not. It cannot. And yet it did. Archivists began to whisper of progressive clarity. They said every reproduction darkened the bricks but sharpened the window. The glass remained unnaturally crisp, almost too clean, while the surrounding details decayed. One technician described it like this: "It's as if the window is not recorded light but an active source, clarifying itself at our expense." He resigned after writing those words. His resignation letter was found decades later, the ink smeared by tears. The obsession grew. Some archivists refused to handle the plate, others could not stop themselves. They would sneak into the vault at night, lock the door, and sit with the negative for hours. One, Jonathan Reiser, a photographic analyst later contracted by the FBI, studied the plate in 1994 with state-of-the-art equipment. His report is mostly redacted, but one leaked note remains. "It is not a double exposure. The grain is consistent with a negative formed in camera, but the light source reflected in the window does not exist." He closed his notes with 3 words scrawled violently in the margin. "Don't stare. Depth is false." Think about that. Depth is false. What did he mean? Some suggest he discovered the geometry of the window does not obey the laws of optics, that it reflects a space that should not exist, an interior where no interior lies. Others believe he was warning that looking into it begins to break the frame of perception itself, that the human mind, like a lens, can be overexposed. Stare too long, and your thoughts begin to fracture. Archivists who ignored his warning paid the price. In the 1930s, 2 curators were dismissed for erratic behavior. One claimed he heard children humming in thirds while cataloguing the plate. The other locked himself in the vault and painted every window in the building black before staff broke down the door. He repeated only one phrase: "She's inside the window, but not inside the room." The exact phrase Finch wrote before vanishing. How does a man in 1935 repeat the words of one who disappeared in 1895 unless the same mouth whispered both? The archivists thought they were caretakers of an artifact. In truth, they were conduits. Every time the plate was handled, every time it was copied, every time it was explained in a symposium, the lightless window spread like a system update. New images, new dreams, new whispers. Even today, the plate does not sit dormant. Ask those who have seen it under glass. They will tell you the same thing. It doesn't just look back, it seems to lean forward, as if the window grows tired of being flat, as if it is trying to step through. What unsettles me most are the accounts of those who looked away. Archivists who closed the drawer too quickly, who refused to handle the glass, who burned their notes. Many of them reported the same phenomenon. The plate appeared in their dreams anyway. One described walking through his childhood home, every wall lined with windows that opened not outward, but inward. Behind each stood a faceless woman, pressing her palm against the glass. He said he woke with his mouth moving silently, reciting a sermon he did not remember learning. Blessed is the house without light. Do you see the mechanism yet? The lightless window does not require believers. It requires attention. Once your eyes trace its edges, once your memory carries its outline, it plants itself in your dreams, your words, your reflections. The Forge thought they were protecting themselves from being named, but in truth, they built an opening that names you instead, and once named, you do not forget. The archivists learned this too late. You may think you are safe because you have not seen the photograph itself, but you have heard the words. You have imagined the frame, the palm against the glass, the children standing behind. That is enough. The doctrine does not need emulsion. It only needs the image to live in your mind. And now it does. Tonight, when you pass your own window, you will glance reflexively at the glass. And if you look long enough, you may think you see your reflection, but look closer. Watch the lips. Are they mouthing words you are not speaking? Are they trying to tell you something you have not yet remembered? That is how it begins. That is how the archivists fell, one by one, cataloguing an artifact that catalogued them in return. The plate remains under lock and key, but the window does not. It has already been opened, and you opened it simply by listening. The doctrine did not stay in Willow Forge, and it did not die with the archivists. It found a new mask: reform. When the 19th century gave way to the 20th, America built more orphanages, poorhouses, and asylums than any other nation on earth. They claimed it was compassion. They claimed it was progress. But behind the brick and mortar, behind the rows of barred windows and the ledgers of wards of the state, the Forge's philosophy lived again. The names were different, the rituals were modernized, but the core was the same. Erase the self and control becomes effortless. Look closely at the records of children admitted to early state reformatories. Pages of names, but beside many entries, a blank. No parent, no surname, unknown origin. Whole generations of children were stripped of identity not by soot jars or inward-facing windows, but by paperwork. To be nameless on a form was to be invisible in the eyes of the law. Officials insisted it was clerical error, incomplete reporting. But the pattern was too consistent. It echoed the Forge's practice exactly. The state didn't need charcoal sermons. It had forms stamped with silence. Then came the institutions themselves. Consider the Kentucky State Asylum for the Insane, where doctors banned mirrors in patient wards, citing distress reactions. Or the orphanages that boarded up every window in their dormitories, claiming it was for warmth or modesty. In New England reformatories, children were forced to sit in circles around a central object, sometimes a stove, sometimes a Bible, eyes lowered, lips unmoving, until a bell released them. The descriptions are chillingly close to Teller's journal about the orphan hearth. Do you see the pattern? Erasure disguised as therapy, ritual disguised as policy. It gets worse. In 1907, an investigative journalist named Clara Mott published a short piece in the Evening Tribune. She described visiting a training home in Ohio where children were forbidden to say their birth names. Instead, each child was called by a number. When she asked a girl her name, the child whispered a string of syllables that Clara did not recognize, then quickly covered her mouth in fear. Days later, Clara retracted her story, calling it exaggerated, but in her private notes, later found in her estate, she wrote, "They make the children forget. They say the unseen listens. A woman walks the halls at night carrying a jar of ash." Do you understand what that means? By the early 20th century, the mother's shape, the faceless figure of the lightless window, had already migrated from folklore into the imagination of new institutions. She had been given halls to walk again. She had been given children to unname again, and no one questioned it because it was framed as care. Reformatories called it discipline. Asylums called it therapy. The state called it progress. But what they were building, brick by brick, was a national orphan hearth. Children stripped of reflection, patients stripped of names, citizens erased by ledgers, all in the name of order, and somewhere behind it all the same doctrine smiled. The visible is temptation, the self is error, blessed is the house without light. You think this is coincidence? No. Institutions are parasitic. They learn from whatever gives them power. The Forge proved you could shape obedience by erasure, and once the state saw the usefulness of that, it did not matter if the original town burned or vanished. The mechanism survived. It was portable. It lived in the paperwork. It lived in the rituals. It lived in the silence of children forced to sit in circles, humming in thirds, mouths closed. And here is the most unsettling truth. Traces of the Forge surface in places far removed from Kentucky. In 1922, a schoolteacher in Massachusetts wrote that her pupils had begun humming a strange tune at night, low, broken thirds like a clock out of rhythm. They told her it was a game they learned at the orphanage. In 1931, a nurse in Pennsylvania reported that her patients would turn their backs before speaking, just as Forge women had done nearly a century earlier. And in 1946, a government inspector visiting a Tennessee boys' home described the walls of a dormitory lined with windows that faced inward, opening only onto hallways. He wrote in his report, "The architecture is illogical. The children stare at the glass until told to sleep." He was reassigned before the report was published. Do you see? The doctrine never left. It was absorbed. It mutated. It disguised itself as procedure, as architecture, as policy. And each time it appeared, the same figure lingered at the edges, the mother's shape. Ask the children who grew up in those institutions. Some of them will tell you of a tall woman, faceless, robed, carrying something blackened in her hands. Some will tell you she came only when they were alone at night. Others say she came when the circle of children was most silent, when no one dared to breathe. They never said her name because she had none. They never admitted what she whispered because the words were not theirs. Now you begin to understand why Barrett's plate matters so much. That photograph is not just a relic. It is proof. Proof that the figure was real enough to leave her imprint in emulsion. Proof that what the forge fed with silence was strong enough to endure for generations. And proof that institutions, knowingly or not, invited her back. So the question becomes, why? Why would reformatories, orphanages, asylums echo the forge's rituals so precisely? Was it mere coincidence? Or was someone, somewhere, ensuring the doctrine survived? Some scholars whisper of a network of archivists and officials who preserved the fragments, not to bury them, but to replicate them. Others argue that the doctrine itself, like a contagion, rewrote the minds of those who handled its remnants. But the truth may be worse. Perhaps erasure is not an infection at all. Perhaps it is the natural language of power, rediscovered again and again because it works. And if that is true, then every institution you've ever trusted carries its own lightless window. A frame that looks back, a doctrine that subtracts, a silence that spreads. By the middle of the 20th century, the forge was long forgotten in public memory, but its shadow had already entered new rooms, classrooms, laboratories, and war rooms. The state no longer needed sermons or jars of soot to strip people of themselves. It had science, psychiatry, and intelligence budgets, and behind the white coats and government seals, the same old doctrine reappeared. Erasure as a tool of power. The lightless window had simply traded its ash for clipboards and steel doors. Consider what was happening in America after World War II. Entire divisions of government agencies were devoted to understanding how the human mind could be broken, raised, made, controlled. The justification was national security. The true hunger was older, the same hunger Reverend Bell had in Willow Forge, to remove the self until nothing remained but obedience. And the state called it research. We have records, some redacted into near meaninglessness, of experiments that sound almost identical to the forge's rituals. Children in group homes forced to sit in circles, denied names, given numbers. Psychiatric patients subjected to mirror deprivation, told to write without ink, their hands tracing words that would never appear. Even soldiers, stripped of identity in training camps, marched until they no longer responded to personal names, only to numbers or tones. Does it sound familiar? It should. These are the forge's methods, dressed in military uniforms. During the Cold War, these practices acquired code names, identity suspension, controlled forgetting, reduction protocols. But peel back the language, and you see the same engine, the subtraction of the self. One declassified memorandum from 1957 describes a project where subjects were made to sit in pitch-black rooms, staring at faint glowing squares painted on the walls. The squares were described as windows by nearly every participant. Some swore they saw figures behind the light, others claimed they heard sermons in their own voices, backwards, in rhythms like psalms. Officials labeled these hallucinations, but archivists who studied the transcripts recognized something older. The forge had returned disguised as science, and here's where the terror sharpens. Because for the first time, the doctrine of the unseen was not whispered in sermons or smuggled in hymnals. It was institutionalized, funded, sanctioned. What the forge performed in secret as ritual, governments replicated in laboratories under fluorescent lights. They called it psychology. They called it national defense. See, But the result was the same. The second window opening, not in ruins, but in the minds of men and women treated as test subjects. We cannot dismiss this as conspiracy theory. The documents exist. They describe subjects forgetting their names, refusing to recognize their reflections, insisting their shadows had stopped following them. One report from 1962 contains the phrase, "Subject reports the sensation of a hand pressing against invisible glass, palm outward. Complains that lips in reflection move independently." That is Barrett's image, Finch's journal, the archivist's whispers, all repeated decades later under the banner of government science. Coincidence does not repeat itself with such precision. The doctrine had infected new hosts. Do you understand the gravity of this? What began as a strange cult in the Kentucky hills had become a prototype for psychological warfare. Erasure was no longer about salvation. It was about control, obedience, national power. And the lightless window was not only a relic, it had become a weapon. Because if you can make a man forget his name, if you can sever him from his reflection, then you can make him into anything you want. A soldier, a prisoner, a blank vessel. And yet, something unexpected happened. Just as in Willow Forge, the figure returned. Reports from subjects mentioned the same presence. A tall woman, faceless, robed. Some saw her in dreams. Others saw her in the reflection of one-way mirrors. One described her as carrying a jar, blackened, heavy, though no such object existed in the room. Another subject drew her compulsively, dozens of sketches of a faceless figure pressing her hand against a pane. When asked why, the subject replied, "She says the window does not close." The same phrase Barrett mailed with his plate in 1896. Do you still believe this is coincidence? The lightless window had found a way to survive. Every translation, sermon, folklore, archive, science. Each time humans tried to suppress it, they gave it a new body. Each time they tried to study it, it looked back. The Cold War did not kill it, it amplified it. And today, though the experiments are said to be over, fragments remain, buried in psychiatric manuals, hidden in classified archives, whispered among scholars who know the risks of speaking too loudly. The doctrine of the unseen has simply changed uniforms once again. Here is the truth you were never meant to hear. The lightless window is not a place. It is a process. It is the act of erasure itself. Every time an institution strips someone of their name, denies them reflection, turns them into data instead of flesh, the window opens wider. Every bureaucratic silence, every missing record, every child turned into a number. Each is another pane of glass, another opportunity for the mother's shape to press her hand and whisper through. You are starting to see why this is dangerous knowledge. The forge was only the beginning. What they called sacred silence became administrative policy. What they worshipped in shadows became research in laboratories. And what Barrett photographed in 1896 was not just a ghost. It was the image of a mechanism that has never stopped moving. You may think you are safe because you have not been tested, numbered, erased, but the doctrine is everywhere. It does not need Willow Forge, it does not even need the plate. It only needs silence, and the silence of institutions has never been louder. Tonight, when you glance into your window, ask yourself, do you see your reflection, or do you see what the state wants you to be? Do you hear your own voice, or the voice that has been assigned to you? And if you look long enough, will you see her hand pressing back, reminding you that the window is still open, that it has always been open? You, thou, at the lightless window belonged to the 19th century. You thought it ended with Barrett's plate or the Cold War experiments. But the doctrine was never about ruins or archives. It was about control. And in the digital age, control does not need soot jars, bricked windows, or even steel vaults. It needs only data. Who you are, where you are, what you choose, and most importantly, what can be erased. Look around you. Every platform, every database, every digital file is a mirror, but unlike the mirror in your home, these reflections are not yours. They belong to systems that decide which fragments of you are preserved and which are discarded. If the Forge worship the unseen by denying children their names, modern systems worship the unseen by reducing you to numbers, profiles, algorithms. And just as the Forge erased names from jars, databases erase you with a keystroke. A deletion, a redaction, a missing entry. Do you see the symmetry? The doctrine of the unseen has adapted perfectly to the 21st century. Consider the archives of government surveillance, terabytes of data collected every second, images of your face, records of your transactions, transcripts of your conversations. You think this makes you more visible, but visibility in a system of power is never safety. It is the prelude to erasure, for what matters is not what is stored, it is what is hidden. Entire populations can vanish digitally, their records flagged, removed, reassigned. Refugees without documents, dissidents whose online profiles are wiped, criminals who exist only as case numbers. This is the Forge reborn, people unmade by omission, their reflections denied by systems that hold the frame. And here is the horror few dare to admit. Erasure is easier in the digital age than in any age before. One keystroke can erase decades of existence. One algorithm can render you invisible in a search. One blackout can make you nameless in the eyes of every institution that matters. In the 1840s, it took rituals of silence and to unname a child. In 2025, it takes nothing more than a database error. The Forge was primitive. Today, the doctrine wears the mask of technology, but there is more. The lightless window itself has adapted, not as brick, not as glass, not even as plate. It exists now as image, circulating online, replicated endlessly, shared in forums, whispered about in threads. A window that grows clearer with every reproduction. Archivists once warned, "Don't stare, the depth is false." But today, staring is compulsive. Screens are windows. You are staring into them now. And if the lightless window is truly a process of attention, if it spreads by being seen, then what happens when millions see it at once? There are reports, scattered but consistent, of users who claim to have found the image hidden in digital archives, not in official museums but in corrupted files, ghosted websites, scans with too much clarity. They describe the same thing. A window in a wall that should not exist, and behind it, a hand pressing against glass, lips moving in silence. Some say the image flickers like static, appearing only for a moment before vanishing. Others claim the longer they stare, the more the hand moves, until it seems to gesture directly at them. Skeptics call it pareidolia. Believers call it the doctrine adapting. But both agree. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. What unsettles me most are the parallels with social media. Think of the algorithms that decide what you see, what you don't, what is remembered, what is buried. Think of the way feeds reorder time, rewrite history, erase posts without explanation. What is that if not the modern orphan hearth? We sit in circles around glowing screens, humming silently with our thumbs, waiting for the next piece of memory to be shown to us or withheld. We do not own the window owns us, and somewhere behind it something watches. You may believe this is just metaphor, but listen carefully. In 2017, a leaked fragment from a defense contractor's internal memo described a project codenamed Glass Mother. Its purpose: simulate presence within reflective surfaces to induce compliance through perceptual destabilization. Does that sound familiar? Test subjects reported the same phenomena as Barrett's plate. Reflections that moved independently, lips mouthing words unsaid, the sensation of a hand pressing back from the glass. The memo was buried. The project denied. But the phrase recurs in other leaks, in whispers from analysts. Glass Mother. The state has not forgotten the doctrine. It has industrialized it. And now, you must confront the truth. The lightless window is not history. It is present tense. Every device you own carries a screen, every screen is a window, and every window, whether you admit it or not, is capable of looking back. You do not merely consume images, you are consumed by them. Each gaze you give strengthens the frame, each silence you keep feeds the doctrine. And tonight, when you put your phone down, when you pass the glass of your window, when you catch your reflection in the darkened screen, will you see yourself or will you see her? The faceless mother, the jar of soot in her hand, lips moving in words you cannot hear. The Forge believed the visible was a curse. They tried to erase it, brick it, silence it, but they were wrong. The curse is not sight. The curse is what sees you back. That was the lesson Finch learned. That was the warning Barrett mailed. That is the reason archivists scrawled depth is false. And that is what you must reckon with now, in the digital age. Every reflection, every window, every screen is open. And the doctrine waits for you, just as it waited for them. You think you're the one watching this video, but tell me honestly, don't you feel the video is watching you? Every story must end, but some endings are known. Not closures. They are openings. The lightless window is one of them. From Willow Forge to Barrett's Plate, from archivists' vaults to Cold War labs, from forgotten rituals to glowing screens in your hands. It has been moving toward this moment, toward you, toward the knowledge you now carry. And once you know, you cannot return to ignorance. You have already stepped into the frame. Understand this clearly. The doctrine was never about superstition. It was about control. The Forge erased children's names to sever their wills. Institutions erased citizens to make them obedient. Modern systems erase your reflection in data to turn you into patterns, trends, commodities. Each era builds its own orphan hearth. Each system repeats the same ritual, not because of coincidence, not because of conspiracy, but because erasure is the most reliable form of power. To remove yourself is to make you infinitely malleable. And behind every act of erasure, the same figure waits, the mother's shape, faceless, hand against the pain. Do you feel the weight of that image yet? A woman who carries a jar of soot, who whispers without a mouth, who presses her palm against the glass. She is not myth. She is the embodiment of every system that strips you of identity. She is the ritual given flesh. She is the doctrine given presence. And when Barrett's Plate captured her in 1896, it was not photography, it was revelation. The lightless window recorded not just her outline, but the process that has stalked you across centuries. This is why Finch's journal ends with the line, "She is inside the window, but not inside the room." He understood it too late. The window is not a place. It is an opening into the erasure itself. You cannot fight her by burning buildings or destroying negatives. She exists in every moment of subtraction, every silence, every missing name. She exists in the empty columns of censuses, in the blank margins of redacted files, in the lines of code that erase your profile when the system decides you are no longer useful. She is the absence itself, given form. And here is the most dangerous knowledge of all. Once you see her, you become part of her process. Every listener, every viewer, every man who leans too close to the story becomes another pain. You are not just hearing this history, you are carrying it forward. You are the next frame in the sequence. And the more you think about it, the clearer she becomes. Not in ruins, not in archives, but in your own reflection. Tonight, when you stand before your window, you will remember these words. You will glance into the dark glass and feel the urge to look away. But if you look too long, you may see lips moving that are not yours. A sermon spoken in silence, a hand pressing outward, waiting for you to acknowledge it. And if you do, the doctrine is no longer history. It is you. You want to believe this is just storytelling, that it ends when the video ends. But tell me, why did you lean in closer? Why did your chest tighten when I spoke of reflections moving without you? Why did you feel watched as you listened? That is the window opening. Not out there, not in Willow Forge, not in the archives, but here, in the awareness that has already changed you. You are not the same man you were before you began this. The doctrine has moved one step further through you. Do you understand now why so many disappeared? Why Finch, Barrett, the archivists, the children, the preachers, all vanished into silence? They did not die of superstition, they were absorbed. The frame does not take life, it takes identity. It erases the self until what remains is only silence, only obedience, only the mouth pressed against the glass. That is the cost of staring too long. But here is Wheeze, where you have a choice. You can close this window now, pretend it was only a story and let the knowledge fade like a dream, or you can admit the truth that you have already opened the frame, that you will never look at your reflection the same way again, that every blank page, every missing record, every silence in the system is another mouth of the unseen. If you choose the second, you will walk differently, you will see differently, and once you see, you cannot unsee. So I will leave you with this final act. Do not type, do not speak, do not share. Simply stand tonight before your window, alone. Watch the glass. Wait until your reflection shifts, even if only slightly. And when it does, and it will, you will know you have crossed the threshold. You will know why Barrett mailed his plate with only one phrase: the window does not close, and neither does this story, because you are inside it now.